I think that's what's good about writing is it forces that clarity and all these different mediums, like to say that, oh, writing is the best thing for everything, it's just a ridiculous statement because it's obvious that there's good things with podcasts and good things with videos. Writing is good because it is just forcing you to stay in one place for a while and have thoughts that are just on the page and just like rewrite and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. And so if you want speed and quick back and forth of communication, you're going to end up with sort of an oral culture where people are speaking through video and speaking through podcasts. But if you want things to be preserved and things to be specified and things to be precise and logical, that's what's good with text.
I have a lot of questions for you related to writing, which I know you have some opinions on.
Yeah. Yeah,
um,
totally.
we,
Once or twice before.
yeah, we do a lot of writing at
Yeah.
levels. Um, a lot of it in very long form,
Yeah.
and we're starting to run into some limits with writing and bumping into some of these edge cases that I'm hoping maybe you have some opinions on. Um,
Yeah.
so I'll just describe one of the specific limitations that we're
Who's
discovering.
going to listen to this? Like, am I speaking to you? Am I speaking to a team? Am I speaking to
Yeah,
who
just
am I speaking to?
like think of the audience as me and our team, but we'll end up publishing it live anyway. But that's really who it's for. Um,
Cool.
the One of the limits that we're seeing with writing as a medium compared to something like video or audio or meetings is that writing does not convey this is my hypothesis that writing is not capable of conveying the same kind of emotional information that you get when you do something in video or in a meeting. The body language, the tone, it's just like I I would say that doing things in writing is almost like pushing information through a lossy compression algorithm.
Mhm.
And so there's just so much, it's denser, but there's just a lot of information that gets lost in that compression. And so there have been conversations that I've witnessed in back and forth written communication where I can see the tension escalating in the conversation, but totally unnecessarily so. Like it's just a misunderstanding of a couple words in a sentence that led somebody to think that somebody was upset about something, even though they weren't, which then just, it almost feels like writing as a communication form is inherently trust depleting in a way that in person or
Interesting.
audio or video isn't. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you have to think of the jobs to be done with each of these mediums. So, audio is very good at riling people up.
Hmm.
If you read certain history books around the invention of radio, the authors repeatedly argue that radio created the ability for dictatorships to happen and for these mass movements to begin
Really?
because, yeah, because of the way that the audio message can fire people up. It can spread widely. It can reach the masses. And audio is very egalitarian in terms of consumption. Everybody understands audio, whereas text is a bit more hierarchical. You know, you could take continental philosophy as example of this. The people who can understand and parse that, they don't just have to have high intelligence, they also need to have high attention spans and then high education of a certain ilk so that they can understand that stuff and process it. So you could basically take those things on opposite ends of the spectrum. Video is adding visuals to audio. So basically, you're suppressing the audio aspect of it. You're adding visuals, but it's super expensive to produce, right? Like, how would you ever communicate via email on video. I mean, I guess you could do Loom or something. So
Yeah, that's what we do.
yeah, okay, so cool. So that is a kind of personality, and I think that video and audio can be fun and stuff. So then that leaves text, I think, on both sides of the barbell. So I think what text is really good at is first, it's cheap and it's efficient. So everyone can receive text. It doesn't cost a lot of storage on your computer. It's pretty easy to fire off. And I think that it's a good balance of exerts higher costs on the producer of something than the consumer of it. Whereas I think audio often actually has higher costs for the consumer of something than the producer of it, right? So, like, say that I call you. Well, now I'm calling you at a time that's convenient for me, but not for you. And you have to pick up. So there's issues with that. You can get a kind of symmetry with voice notes, but then text is also really good on the other side in terms of preservation. So what's great about text is we know that text is going to be around in 30, 50 years, and it forces a kind of compression that then can be valuable. So compression, I think we need to talk about that because compression is an issue when it's stripping out emotions in a conversation that needs to have a certain emotional tenor. Compression is an issue when there are things that need to be said that don't make it into the message. But compression is good when it comes to, say, onboarding, when there's things that you need to read, and you could have a whole team working on a document, and they can compress that into its finest parts so that it stays preserved. So you could almost think of a tension here between lossiness and preservation and lossiness and efficiency.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because this ties into one of the other things that I have in my notes that for some reason, this is another hypothesis, it feels like writing is a lot harder than just like firing off a loom or an audio note or just like, hey, let's just get on a call. Um, I don't totally know why that is, and but people are more than happy to watch a 1 hour recording of a meeting, but spending 15 minutes writing out thoughts feels much more burdensome. I don't know if it's like emotionally burdensome or what, but one of the things that was most interesting to me, I did a retrospective on how I spent my time for my first 2 years at Levels. And one of the biggest surprises is we write a lot. Like I've personally written hundreds, probably thousands of pages of long form documentation and philosophy and strategy within the company. And I thought it was easily 20% of my total time was spent writing these documents. And when I actually did the math, it was about 5%, which is actually not that much. Like I spent way more time in just casual meetings than I did doing these things that were incredibly valuable, but just felt way harder. So I don't know um, what it is about writing specifically that makes it feel so burdensome to people.
I think it's that you have to think and you have to confront the limits of thinking. And you have to actually stop and contend with ideas and realize that you don't know things and that you have to be more precise with things. And I think that's what's good about writing is it forces that clarity and all these different mediums. Like, to say that, oh, writing is the best thing for everything, it's just a ridiculous statement because it's obvious that there's good things with podcasts and good things with videos. But like, from the producer side, writing is good because it is just forcing you to stay in one place for a while and have thoughts that are just on the page and just like rewrite and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. And if you talk to a good author, it's painful and they'll have rewritten that book, 5, 6, 8 times and they'll just do it over and over. And so if you want speed and quick back and forth of communication, you're going to end up with sort of an oral culture where people are speaking through video and speaking through podcasts. But if you want things to be preserved and things to be specified and things to be precise and logical, that's what's good with text. And it's no coincidence that the Industrial Revolution and a sense of like scientific progress and technological growth happens after the invention of writing, because there's a paper that Patrick Collison cites a lot. Um, Not a lot. I've heard it a couple times. And he says that everybody knows that the printing press sort of enabled the Industrial Revolution because you could have ideas spread. But that sort of gets invalidated with radio and with video. What is really interesting about writing is that rather than looking at the system as a whole, you can dissect the parts. And so you can take clause 3C, the third line, and you can say, I have an issue with that. Whereas, like, if we have a transcript of everything I've said for the first 12 minutes, how would you do that? How would you be precise and recall exactly what I said? Because Sam, you could say something, and then I could say, no, 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 I said something different. And now we're having a game of emotional ping pong of what did I say? But then if we can go into the text, now, like you said, we're no longer speaking emotions, but we're speaking in specific words. And then we can focus on that, improve that little section, and move on. And look, there's issues with that. Sometimes you do need this sort of global system. Maya Angelou said, people will never, or people will forget what you said, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And so that is sort of like a global
Right.
macro way to think about this. But sometimes, you could basically invert that. You could say, this is going to sound really crude, and I don't actually mean what I'm saying. I'm just proving a point that in when you're trying to get stuff done, no one cares how you feel. People just care what you say. And so I think that writing is good for that.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've run a lot of different experiments personally trying to understand this emotional cost problem. And so I did an experiment. So one of the things that I've noticed with video, I did a podcast with Vinay from Loom to try to understand some of this stuff because he's thought about video in much the same way that you thought about writing, just like really deep thinker on the topic. And I did, we do a lot of things asynchronously with Loom. So we'll do unidirectional meetings where I just record myself and then send it to the group. And people don't actually need to be physically present. But what I notice is that there's a certain stiffness that comes with that. There is something about seeing a face on the other side of the screen and seeing how they're reacting to what you say that completely changes the tone of what you're saying. And I tried to do this with my co-founder Josh. He said, "Hey, I want to try this thing. I need to write this important memo, but I don't have the emotional energy for it. Can you just get on a call with me for an hour and see if that helps?" And it was fun. Like we spitballed on it. We talked. I got the transcript after. I was like, all right, all I'm going to have to do, take the transcript, edit the text a little bit. And in that basically 2 hours of company time, I got like a couple sentences of value out of it. It was shockingly little. And I don't really know what to make of that because I felt like at the end of that meeting, I had solved all of these problems. But the actual density of information in that meeting was so incredibly low, much lower than I was anticipating.
What's the lesson there? Is the lesson there that conversation does have low density, or is the lesson there this particular meeting? Like, like, where do you want me to follow there?
Yeah, I mean, it ties into the how it made you feel because both Josh and I felt like it was productive, but when we actually looked at the output, it wasn't. So I'm wondering, it ties into that concept that you mentioned, but also I I was surprised to see how different the feeling was than the actual output of the conversation was. So um, I found for myself, this is one of your famous tweets around writing and connecting the dots,
Yeah.
and um, I found for me that writing, I often discover ideas in the process of writing that I don't in the process of conversation.
course.
And I don't, if you think about just, we'll take the proxy of the conversation I have with Josh. In the same amount of time that I was conversing with him, if I had just spent the time writing out my thoughts and thinking about it myself, I probably would have solved a lot more of these problems.
Well, here's the thing. So conversation is an algorithm for randomness. Writing is an algorithm for depth. So basically, here's what I mean by that. We've been talking now for 15 minutes. I have created and what's come out of my mouth is a bunch of things I've never said before and a bunch of ways of thinking about something that I've
Yeah.
never had. And in conversation, I'm forced to come up with an initial structure for those ideas. But if I were to look at the transcript of what I have said so far, I wouldn't be satisfied with the precision and the clarity of what I'm saying. So, conversation is a
Right.
very good place to find new areas, new territories, say, "Oh, wow, that's a part of my brain I've never come across before." That's like a new plane of reality that my brain has never traveled. It's a new zip code I didn't know existed, but it's not you're not building houses. Writing is where you're building houses. You're thinking through the plumbing of an idea. You're going in, you're like adding furniture and stuff like that. And then what's great is once you have that, then it's much easier to speak about whatever the thing is that you've written about. And so I think that there's a certain intuition that you have to develop that I think we have to develop as a culture around these different modes of communication and when is writing the place to go versus other things. One thing that I do think is a pretty good change though is the death of everybody has to be in the same room PowerPoint presentations. I think that that's sort of the worst of all worlds. But like
Right.
if you take something like if you take something like, there's also I just wanna say there's also different kinds of writing here. So, see, this is what I mean. This is a new idea I've never had before. So you're bringing me into new territory. So I think that there's writing as speech, and then there's writing as, um so let's call it writing as conversation, and then writing as a sort of refined thought. And so email writing is more writing as speech. This is like two people talking. And if you were to take that a step further, that's texting, right? Texting, like I just sent a text to a friend, hey, let me think about it, but not let me. It's LEMME. Let me think about it, right? I'm actually trying to replicate speech patterns and personality in the way that I'm
Right.
sending a text.
With emojis and
Whereas
such.
exactly, right? But it also it comes into the way that the language is formed. And then there's writing as like very refined thought. And so I think it's worth asking, like, why does Jeff Bezos get so much out of writing those annual letters? So you could say there's a scale component, there's a lastingness of those ideas component, there's a he's just getting clarity on what are the big themes of the year. And I see the same thing with my annual review. I spent like 2 weeks, and this is all that I worked on. This annual review, giant piece, but what's great is I know that by writing this thing, I have it forces me to do the work to clarify what are my goals for the next year? Where did I fail? Where did I do well last year? And think, what are my values? And then what's great about writing is a certain scannability. So, like, for example, when I was using levels and night two, I had Noki and my glucose spiked to the moon, maybe to Mars. I was like, "Dude, what
Yeah.
happened?" Right? What happened? And you had an article right there, and so I started reading different levels articles, and in my notes, I can go back and look at levels articles and what mattered to me, and I can now think better about my food. And so there's a transferability, whereas, like, if you only had videos, then I wouldn't be able to go back and reference that.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. The related to the we'll start with, I actually want to talk both about the conversational component of writing and the long form component of writing. Um, by complete coincidence, yesterday I wrote a memo on why we write so many memos. It's on long form memos. and decision making. And one of the things that we'll start with the conversational piece. The I don't know if this has been your experience, but we've been doing a lot of experimentation around this. I have found, at least my hypothesis here is that conversational messaging in text form is inherently trust depleting between people. Like Toby from Shopify talked about this idea of a trust battery. And when you see people's face, when you see them in person, when you hear their tone, when you empathize with them, you're recharging the trust batteries. When you see somebody behind, it's just like text communication behind a screen, this back and forth, which almost always, because of the compression, leads to lost information and ease of misunderstanding. I It really does feel like written conversational form is inherently depleting in terms of trust in a way that other forms of communication aren't. Is that reasonable?
Yeah, I think that given given what you're saying, the answer is yes. The one caveat I would add would be something like a performance review where you want to write that out. And then what you want to do is come in with it written, go through the points one on one through speech and through conversation, and then give it to them so that there's an emotional frame that people can map on to what you've written. But I do agree. If you just, hey, here's your yearly performance review and all the things that you did wrong, like that's going to hit someone deep and it's going to cut and it's not going to feel good. And so specifically the answer is yes. I see exactly what you're saying. The big thing I would add to that is there's times where you do wanna write something to think through whatever it is that you're saying, and I do this all the time. Like, if I'm gonna have a difficult conversation, like, I'll show up at dinner with something written, often in bullet points, have the conversation, and then give it to them after as a central record of truth, right? Like, the record of truth is a big thing here, right? It's not a coincidence that the Magna Carta and Hammurabi's Code, like, these are things that are written, they're not things that are
Yeah,
said,
right.
right?
Yeah, so an interesting counterpoint to the writing as inherently trust depleting. So the memo that I just wrote on memos is actually about how writing and long form writing specifically is actually trust enhancing
Hmm,
and is necessary for delegating decisions and for trust in leadership, where um, you can have lots of meetings with people to try to understand their way of thinking, but it's only after somebody writes their thoughts in long form, when you could follow along with their thought process, when they go deep on a concept and you can understand how they think about problem solving. Like a lot of the people who join levels for a leadership role, the first thing they do is they write a long memo on their area of
so
focus.
this is really interesting.
Yeah.
We're now getting into 2 different kinds of trust. There was the trust that you talked about with the trust battery, which is a great concept, and that is the trust of emotion and empathy and the trust that leads to friendship. That is a heart-driven trust. Now what you're talking about is mind-driven trust, which is the trust of expertise, and that is, I trust this person, they have written this, and I'm gonna go contact them. So I would say that even the impetus for this meeting is exactly that kind of trust. I've clearly written a lot about writing. You've seen that. You've seen it over time. And you said, okay, David is somebody who's thought a lot about this. And I basically did a proof of stake by
Yeah.
words. And then you said, okay, now I trust him with the expertise. And so I think that we're talking about 2 different kinds of trust here.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. Um, a a specific recent example, Maz, who we just brought on to lead, he's head of business. He just last week finished his first long form memo, sort of define what he's going to be working on, and it's 12,000 words, which is actually not uncommon for the length of a memo at levels. Um, we really do expect people to put significant, deep thought into what it is that they're doing. And one of the main advantages for me is that it really it really does build my confidence when I see how they think about approaching problems. One of the challenges that we're having is what I'll call, I think I've heard it called context collapse,
Yeah.
which is we have so much information
Yeah.
that that 12,000 word memo, some of that really does need to be seen by engineering, but maybe like one paragraph.
Right.
And it is it is too much to ask of the writer, of the author, to know the context of every business unit to create a separate memo for each unit.
Right. That'd be
Like,
ridiculous.
it'd be ridiculous because they also don't know what the other people need to know.
But
The
see,
context.
that's a great example of then Moz should make a loom and should say, "Hey, in the description of the loom, refer to the one paragraph and have the loom add context."
Yeah, definitely. We actually started doing a Loom summary at the top of each of these memos, which has been really helpful. Just like the 10-minute walkthrough of the high level concepts. That's been good. We've been considering the idea of hiring what we would call a librarian or a head documentarian, somebody
Nice.
whose job it is just to, they're like the context masters.
Yep.
They read everything and they synthesize it for like the weekly engineering summary or the weekly editorial summary, everything the editorial team needs to know. um, we haven't done it because it feels like busy work almost.
You should look into governments, and I bet that there's somebody in the cabinet of the president, maybe in America, maybe somewhere else, who does this position. So, like,
Interesting.
because this has to happen, right? So, like,
Yeah,
how does the president get this? And there's all of these memos that are written. So, who is doing that summary, that filtration? Because it's not the chief of staff. They're doing a bunch of other stuff. So, yeah, where does that role exist? And for me, what comes to mind is government.
that's fascinating. I know some people that I'm gonna ask that exact question. Um, the One of the other things I had in my notes here for the call is circling back to the concept of the high emotional cost of writing. Um, are
I feel it every morning.
yeah,
Never changes.
yeah, totally. One of the things that one of our engineers, Jinlu, I had a conversation with her about writing, and she had a hypothesis that I think might be accurate, or at least somewhat. It's certainly an input, which is that there's something around the ambiguity of time to completion
Hmm,
that comes with writing. If you have a 1 hour meeting, you know you're committing to an hour. When I start writing a memo, I'm opening Pandora's box.
yeah.
Like, there's meetings are in manager time and writing is in maker time.
Yep.
Like, I will not be able to muster the emotional energy to start writing something unless I have the entire rest of the day blocked off. I'm just incapable of it. I know some people can block like 6 hours to write. I can't. I have to have nothing else going on, or I just can't muster the emotional energy. So, and sometimes that memo ends up taking 45 minutes, even though I blocked off the whole day.
Yeah.
And like Tom on our team mentioned how there have been some memos that he kept punting them for months, and he finally got around to writing it. It took him an hour and a half. He's like, "Why did I wait for so long to do this? I don't understand."
Yeah, but that happens to me with chores, right?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, I gotta mail in my Texas voter registration. It's been on my table for so
Yeah,
long.
right.
But I think with writing in particular, that time when you're thinking through something, when it's stirring in your mind, you're also thinking about it. And so, look, I think that what we're coming to here is you absolutely positively do not want to write for a lot of these things. And like writing is almost like a time horizon. Like there's a time horizon function. So I just did these and I promise this relates to what we're talking about. just okay, here's something else. So when I was a kid, I always wanted, good sports jerseys, and my parents would never buy me the nice sports jersey. Like, I wanted the authentic one, with, like, the actual, like, Adidas or Nike, and they would never do it. I was like, "Mom, why?" I get so frustrated. She'd be like, "David, it makes no sense to buy you this jersey if in 6 months you're gonna grow out of it. It makes no sense. We're gonna spend $200 and you're not gonna be able to have it."
Yeah.
And so then, like, I got really frustrated as a kid, and my mom was totally right. She was totally right. So then,
Right.
uh, a couple weeks ago, I was in Montreal, and I I didn't own, like, I s until then, I didn't own, like, a nice winter coat, like, a coat that if it's anything more than, between 10 and 30 degrees, like, I can put on a coat and, like, I'm not gonna be freezing cold. Like, I bought one from Amazon my entire time living in New York City, it just made me hate the winter, but I just, like, didn't have the money to buy something. And I basically, like, started thinking, "Okay, I really wanna get a Canada Goose jacket. It's gonna cost me $1,000, 5 times more than those jerseys,
Yeah.
but the reason I ended up doing it and I had to, like, wait in line before I went to the store, and, we, like, walked to downtown so I could go get it, was because I'm gonna own that coat for the rest of my life. All this to say, writing is you want those long-term things that are gonna last the test of time, like a Canada Goose jacket, and sometimes it's good to get the knockoff jersey, and I'm not saying that podcasting and video is a knockoff jersey, like, it's a metaphor, but all this to
Yeah.
say, you wanna be writing when it's something that is, that everyone needs to see, it needs to be, you want that message to be relevant in a couple years, you want it to be both skimmable and you want it to be precise, you want many people to comment on it, you wanna be able to go in specific sentences, and you want things like, if you're writing your yearly thing where every single person at Levels is gonna read this, I think that should be written. I think that should be written. But, like, your weekly review that's, in a 20-minute meeting, of course you shouldn't spend all these hours writing it. So I think that there's a time horizon function here.
Yeah, it's a good point. And like number of people who follow it. I mean, some of our longest strategy memos, like our editorial strategy, was written a year ago, and it's still relevant.
Of course.
Like, our editorial director put many, many weeks, if not months, into writing it, and then it became the strategy. So I look back on some of our foundational strategy documents, and I'm shocked by how they're still relevant, like a year, 2 years later. So I definitely hear that.
Yeah, I mean, also, I just see from my inner review, so we've been hiring a bunch of people, and people will ask certain questions, "Hey, what's the vision, and how's the company structured?" And had I not written out those answers, there just wouldn't be a level of clarity. Like, writing is gonna force clarity, and so you have to think of writing as basically like a high investment activity. And so the only thing, like a Canada Goose jacket, that's gonna justify a high investment is a long time horizon or volume of a lot of people can read it, but even then, that doesn't mean that you should necessarily write. And also something that you really need clarity around whatever it is that you're saying.
Yeah. And I also actually want to circle back to something you said just a minute ago that struck me, which is that you're also postponing chores. But I think what you're also implying is that writing feels like a chore.
It's really hard.
Yeah. Because, like, I'm sure this has happened to you all the time where somebody says, "Hey, can we just jump on a call?" And you're like, "Yeah, okay, whatever." How many times has somebody said, like, "Hey, can you just write up a quick memo on this and send it to me?" And you're like, "Ah," it's like, "Can I do it by the end of the week? I don't really want to do that right now." But that,
Well, the thing is, it's just like, I just love the idea that writing is weightlifting for the mind. And the thing is, you can go to the gym and you can, put up some serious iron, and everyone's like, "Yeah, of course that's tiring. Of course you're gonna crash harder that night." But if you really need to dive into certain ideas, you know that there's a cost that's gonna come from that, right? Like, if you're no one's, like, weightlifting in the morning and then it's like, "Okay, I know that I have the same amount of energy for the afternoon to do something else."
Yeah,
And
right.
writing is the same way. I mean, after this, I have to edit a document for my friend, and I've just sort of been postponing it, because I know that that's gonna require serious thinking, and it's gonna make me tired.
Yeah. One of the other categories of problems that I'm trying to think through is um, there's this concept of, we'll call it finality
Hmm.
of ideas or decisions that uh, for I'll give you a specific case study. So we when we hire a candidate, we would often write out what the job description is. We'd write out why we're hiring this person, and we would post it. And then we would get questions from people later on of like, why are we hiring this person? I don't understand. We started just as an experiment doing decision meetings where two people who were talking about that candidate, they basically just read out loud all of the things that were written down. And for whatever reason, that because there was a meeting where people agreed on something, even though it's all the same content, it leads to much more cohesion and finality on decisions. And so one of the problems we have in, say, our communication tools, in some of our long form memos, even, is it's like every question or comment opens up a new open thread. And the conclusion of those threads never reaches like a certain point of finality. And so we've tried different approaches. And on one end, the long form memos can feel like tablets from Moses of like, this is the answer, and like no one can question it. And on the other end, it leads to just a never ending series of open questions that never leads to that same feeling of resolution and finality. So um, I don't know what exactly to make of that, but it's a consistent problem.
Well, I think that so let's talk about the tablet for Moses thing. It's hilarious, but the thing is, in the modern age, Moses can do a collaborative Google Doc before he brings them down from Mount Sinai, right? Or something like that, you know? I mean, only Moses was actually allowed up on Mount Sinai, you know, to go be with the burning bush. So the metaphor doesn't quite hold, but you know,
Right.
you know, we can be some Bible reconstructionists here and, you know,
Right.
make our metaphor.
Uh-huh.
Um, but 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 that's the thing. And it's just important that there for certain kinds of projects that there is space for that collaboration, but also that finality is important. It's important. The Declaration of Independence is not the perfect document. The Bill of Rights is not the perfect document, but it's one that we have. It's set in stone and well, it's set in papyrus, but like the Magna Carta was set in stone. And there's an importance to that. And I don't think that having things be perfect is necessarily the best thing, because sometimes you're better off with something that is imperfect, but where you have alignment. And if you're so focused on perfection, what you're giving up there is a certain amount of alignment and cohesion. And, you know, it's like a boat. It's like a boat, right? Or it's like a rowboat. And I love watching the rowers in Austin because they're all moving the same speed. But, you know, if people start pedaling differently, you don't have the coxswain at the front of the boat, and now you're getting friction in places where there shouldn't be, and the boat slows way down even though the total units of effort are the same, if not more. And so what is so interesting about all this is there's trade-offs in every single place. And so a lot of these questions are just what is the problem to be solved? What is the job to be done? And then what are the best tools or combination of different mediums that are going to allow us to achieve that outcome the best?
Yeah, that makes sense. I wonder in the context of finality or closure, Um, in we'll take this in the written conversational form as maybe the medium. Um, what in your from your perspective, what is it about meetings specifically of people being in the same room at the same time, or actually in like an interesting parasocial way, watching people in a meeting at the same time make a decision? What is it about that that feels so different than coming to decisions in writing?
Well, I don't know, 'cause I'm not sure I have enough experience with watching other people set decisions in meetings. Generally, I just ask them to send me a write-up of the decision and what they spoke about that is supposed to be lossy. I don't need to know everything
Right.
that happened in the meeting. I just wanna know in 5 to 6 sentences, what are we gonna do and why are we gonna do it? And I see writing so often as proof of work. It's just like, "Okay, we're gonna make
Yep.
this change in Rite of Passage." "Okay, why? Send me a memo."
Yep.
And if you don't care enough to then send me a it doesn't even need to be a page, 3 paragraphs of why you made this decision, why
Yep.
you're thinking about it, that then then I almost don't trust it in a sense.
Yep.
It's a way of showing me that you care instead of telling me that you care or something like that.
Yeah. It's so one of the topics that I have in the memo about long form memos is that um, there's there were organizations that lead by title, where it's like, I'm the head of X, therefore I don't need to explain myself to you, just do what I say.
Right.
And then there are organizations that are built on like real trust, like deep trust, where it's it's a culture where people are treated like adults. Like it's reasonable for an adult to ask, why are we doing this?
Mhm.
And writing allows you to do that, to answer those questions in a scalable way. Um, one of the one of the things that I'm sure my team is sick of hearing me say at this point is that content solves a lot of problems. Like content scales, whether it's an audio, whether it's a video. One of the things that we actually do, all of our meetings internally are recorded,
Mm.
and we don't distribute most of them, but maybe 1 out of 10 meetings, there's this like a random gem that appears in the conversation. There was one recently where two people in their one-on-one, somebody was explaining their thoughts and methodology on business deals. And he said, like, this is like, we have to clip this and share this with the team. This is so interesting. And some of these internal conversations we even end up publishing externally and they get thousands of views from random people.
That's probably
Um,
great for hiring too.
yeah, exactly. It is. And it really does build trust. Interestingly, yesterday, I think it was yesterday, I got an email from a candidate. He was asking about what our clinical strategy is. And I sent him a long form document on clinical strategy, which Lauren Kelly Chu on our team wrote up. In fact, I'm gonna pull it up here and find out just how many words it is. Um, she spent more than a month writing it, and the document is 7,000 words. And like the candidate responded with like it's really encouraging to see the depth of thought that has gone into these ideas, and that's that trust building that I don't think you can get in any other way other than writing. It seems like that's the
No.
only format that
There's a
works.
reason that people give out books as business cards and not documentaries,
Yeah, right, right. Yeah, for sure.
not YouTube videos.
Right.
If someone has written about something, you inherently trust them, right? Like, think of how often you'll hire someone. Oh, they wrote a book on the subject. Have you read the book? No, but they wrote the book on the subject.
Yeah.
We just know
Yeah.
culturally that there's a level of work that comes with that,
Yeah.
and you can wing it with video and podcasting in a way
Yeah.
you can't do with writing.
Yep.
People know that, and so the thing is, Most of the time, though, you gotta wing it. I mean, if you took the intensity that you bring to writing for most of the things that you do, you would never go anywhere. Your your feet would just be stuck like glue because everything would take too long.
Yeah, and I wonder. So one of the things that I wanted to touch on again is this idea of context collapse,
Yeah.
where almost every person who's worked for more than a couple years at a company has experienced this, where there becomes a point where there is so much information that the signal gets lost in the noise.
Mhm.
And like now your the context that is needed to solve problems just ends up collapsing. And uh, Darren Murph from GitLab said something in a conversation I had with him a couple months ago that really stuck with me. And I keep thinking about it because we're dealing with this right now. We have too much communication happening, or at least I shouldn't say too much communication. There is too much communication noise and people are getting lost. I was doing a screen share with our head of design, Alan, the other day. I saw his screen and I noticed that he has almost 700 unread messages in threads, which is our communication tool, which is like just way too many. Like it might as well be infinity. And one of the proposals that people have said on the team is like, well, maybe we should do more things as direct messages and not share as much to everyone. And Darren said something that it stuck with me, which is, do you ever hear people argue that there's too much information on the internet? It's like, no, obviously not.
Yeah.
So like too much information can't be the problem that you're describing.
Yeah.
It's something
It's
about,
filter failure.
yeah,
Somebody said information overload doesn't exist. It's filter failure.
yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I wonder how I imagine you have a lot of writing internally. How do you think about solving these problems? Not necessarily tactical implementations, but like approaches to solving it.
Well, how big is levels in
We're
terms
about
of
40 people.
yeah, I mean, we're just not, right?
Yeah.
So we're small. I mean, it's just every big decision has to be made in writing.
Yep.
Sort of just that simple. And then most of the smaller things are done in meetings and text messages. We don't have that issue yet.
Okay.
We really don't. And so the thing that I would say though is as you scale as a company, you have to solve the filter problem
Hmm.
with with writing and basically exerting right like if you want less of something to happen naturally, you have to exert some cost on it.
Hmm.
And one of the things that you can do is you can promote long form writing internally. And what you're doing there is you're saying, okay, the things that get shared are going to have a long form writing component, which is going to force people to think about things. Now, one of the big issues with that, though, so you're going to attract people who are writers, but you're going to create a a just a certain inegalitarianism where certain people are better writers than others. And so you're now hurting the people who don't write well. And maybe they can team up with other people to really think through things. And then one of the things I would say is, maybe there's like the levels gold channel. Okay. So this is where good, vetted by Sam and executive writing gets put in. And
Mm.
this is like comes in a weekly newsletter or something like that. So then what happens is at the top of every essay, there's a 10-minute Loom video. Once you have an essay, now you've done what you need to in order to get something published on the podcast. And the essay is like, or the memo is like a way of doing the work in order to then be heard over time. And I think so when you're 400, I think that that'll be more the case. When you're 4,000, I think that that'll definitely have to be something because when you're 4,000, you can't have the same Slack or whatever back and forth that you
Mhm.
have now. But when you were 4 or 10, like we are now, you can get away with a lot of those things. So, yeah, that's how I think about it. I would think of writing exerts a cost, but the benefit of the increased cost is compression and efficiency, but Then you got to solve the emotional issues for certain things. I mean, if you're talking about certain kinds of strategy, right? Your go to market for glucose monitors, I don't know. I'm just
Right.
making something up. Then then you don't need a certain emotional subtlety. But if you're talking about, hey, this company isn't serious like it used to be. You know, we used to show up. It was early startup days. We used to grind, 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 grind. Saturday afternoon, we would always meet in a coffee shop, me and the founders,
Yeah.
and we would get after it so hard. And now none of you even care that much or try hard. I sense, it's remote work and you're cutting off at 3:30, all those sorts of things. No, you can't write that. There needs to
Right.
be an emotional wrapping around that message.
Yeah. And it actually, it's funny, it ties into that. Um, One of the first indications uh, that there's something different about writing was um, in one of our Friday forums, just the team all hands. Somebody made a joke, and I didn't think anything of it, but um, there was some subtext that somebody found like marginally offensive, and it was, they called me, they explained the situation, said like, should I write this to them and tell them? And I immediately said, you should actually call them because there's something about writing that feels like a threat or a reprimand or something that the exact same words in a call just doesn't have the same sort of weight. And it was just a passing comment. The person didn't know the subtext of this thing, and it ended up not being a problem. But there's something about writing that just it has something deeper that like
Totally.
escalates these problems. So I don't know what that means.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I had a really uncomfortable interaction yesterday, and I got to call this guy and be like, "Dude, what?" But I would, I could have texted him. I got to call him. Actually, I got to FaceTime him, right? Like FaceTime adds a whole other element of personality and honesty, and that's always what I do. If I have a difficult interaction. Mom called me on Sunday night. Dad's mad at you. Dad gets a FaceTime. It's not a
Right,
text, right?
right,
It's like,
right.
Dad, we got to talk about this,
Yeah.
and then have that. And I I agree, and I think that it's funny with things like this because everybody thinks that they know this, and there's certain things that people don't know that they don't know, and then there's certain things that they don't know that they know, and the don't know that they know is a really tricky place to be. I always think about
Yeah.
this in building a career. Like
The
when I
Dunning-Kruger
started,
problem.
I wanted to work in social media, and the problem with social media is people actually aren't good at social media, but everyone's got Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat. So like, oh, I'm a social media expert. I don't need to hire you. And so the point is in imparting these ideas, you can't baby people and it has to be done intelligently. And also, there's just, a certain set of cultural norms to build around these things. Actually, that's an interesting idea. With things that people don't know, but they think they know, maybe the solution is cultural norms instead of explicit things that you're saying, because sometimes the explicit nature of things feels like you're talking down to people. Hey, if you have an issue with somebody, call them instead of text them. They're like, geez, what is this, the third grade? But 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 then if
Yeah.
if you're sort of leading by example and you're creating a culture, which is just a set of precedents and a way of doing things where it's okay to call people, then I think maybe you can solve those issues.
Yeah, and it's funny actually the role that writing plays in surfacing the things that you thought you knew but you don't actually know.
Of course.
Like the number of times that like I had an idea that I thought was very clear and crystallized, and other people on the team were confused by it. And I was like, "Ah, fine, I'll just write a memo on this." And I start writing it. I'm like three sentences in. I'm like, that's kind of it. It's kind of all I've got. Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe I didn't know this topic as well as I thought I did. And it required a lot more exploration and thought to really crystallize that to get it out to the team.
Writing is a process of digging.
Yeah.
It's you're in one place and you just keep digging and you keep digging and you keep digging and you go into different layers and you discover weird things. And as you dig, there are these weird ways that the topology of ideas begin to come together and synthesize. And it's almost like the geology of your own mind or something. And you just, on Monday, I put together like 4 different dots. It was like the history of Christianity with psychedelics, with like why we're thinking differently about how we create things. And I was like, "Oh my god, no one's ever, to the best of my knowledge, no one's ever had this idea before." It's like brought in with like Freudianism and the surrealists. I was like, it was just one paragraph. I was like, "How did I end up here?" And I think that's what writing is really, really, really helpful with.
Yeah.
And that's sort of like deep down in the context of something I'd been thinking about for a long time. But like you said, that requires a tremendous amount of work and patience, and digging is the antithesis of, it's like a vertical exploration rather than a horizontal one.